CD5.
Chapter 12. We are all looking for the one person who will give us what we're lacking in this life. And if we don't manage to find him, we can only pray that he will find us. Desperate Housewives. Florida, 1976. Elliot is 30. They'd gotten on the road at dawn. There was a strong north wind that had cleared the sky and carried off the first fall leaves. At the wheel of the Thunderbird, Elliot was heading toward Miami, while Elena lay asleep in the passenger seat. She had managed to arrange 2 days off, and they had decided to spend a long weekend in Key West, where Elena's paternal uncle lived. It was a getaway they'd promised themselves for years, but they'd always put it off. We always think we have time. For the 10th time in 5 minutes, Elliot turned his head and made sure that nothing was disturbing Elena's sleep. He looked at her as if she were a fragile and precious object that he had to take care of. Her steady, peaceful breathing contrasted sharply with the worry gnawing at him. He should have taken full advantage of his vacation and the renewed intimacy with the woman he loved. And yet his mind was elsewhere, completely absorbed by what his double had revealed to him. He could still hear those threatening words echoing in his head. "Elena will die soon, because you killed her." It all seemed absurd. But for the moment, unfortunately, he had to admit that everything else the man had told him had turned out to be true. He'd thought about it all night, and one thing had intrigued him. If Elena was going to die, why hadn't his time traveler given him the information that would help him save her? Above all, why had he said that it was the last time he'd come back? "Keep your eyes on the road, not on me," Elena warned, opening her eyes and stretching. "The problem is you're better looking than the road." As she leaned toward him for a kiss, he was suddenly tempted to tell her everything. "Listen, I've met someone from the future who told me that you were going to die soon. And get this person is me in 30 years. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He couldn't tell her something like that, simply because it didn't make any sense. You can ask a friend or a lover to believe the unbelievable within certain limits, but this time things had gone far beyond any limits. Like Matt, Elena couldn't be his ally in this battle. He was going to have to fight it alone, and he didn't feel up to it. He felt crushed by the weight of what was happening to him, and once again he had doubts about his own sanity. But this spell of depression didn't last. Of course he had an ally, his double. He just had to find a way of forcing him to come back and give a hand. Last time, he'd had the idea of the tattoo to send a message into the future. This time, he'd have to figure something else out. But what? San Francisco, 2006. Elliot is 60. After 2 long days of rain, the sun was shining on San Francisco once more. Elliot and his daughter had decided to spend the day together. They rented bikes, rode across the Golden Gate Bridge, and wandered all morning in rural Marin County. They said not a word about the disease. They were living each moment with a feeling of urgency, determined to savor to the full this treacherous life that can only be fully appreciated when you are about to leave it. They stopped in Sausalito at noon and spread a blanket out on the beach to picnic near the ocean. They spoke little, content merely to be in each other's company. Now nothing had any importance beyond the fact that they were together. After eating, they got back on their bikes and rode along the coast to the little town of Tiburon, where they stopped at a stand that rented jet skis. Angie was dying to have a go, but when she was a little girl, She needed her father's encouragement to overcome her fears. As he watched his daughter climb onto the vehicle and cautiously steer it away from the jetty, Elliot thought over what had happened to him the night before. Thanks to the third pill, he'd been able to see Elena again, a few weeks before she died. Up to that point, everything had seemed simple. He'd returned to the past, he'd seen Elena, and everything was fine. But far from satisfying him, this last trip back in time had disturbed him and had revived old wounds, guilt, and regret. Most of all, he was mad at himself for having talked too much, and now he was worried about the possible repercussions of what he had said. He should never have warned his double about Elena's death, and he must never surrender to the temptation of going back to the past to change the course of events. And yet that temptation was great. If he took just one more pill, he could save Elena from death. Except that you can't change the past with impunity. That much he was sure of. Until now, he'd managed to limit the damage by behaving as a mere spectator from the future. But if he started trying to interfere in the events of his past life, things could become complicated. Everybody knew about the butterfly effect and chaos theory. Through a series of chain reactions, an insignificant event could bring about a large-scale catastrophe. The flapping of a butterfly's wings in Japan could cause a hurricane in Florida. He had 7 pills left, but he promised himself he wouldn't use them. For if Elena didn't die, then the Elliot of 1976 would live his life with her. They would buy a house and surely have children. But Elliot would never meet Angie's mother, which would amount to forfeiting his daughter's life. No matter which way he looked at the problem, he always came to the same conclusion. Saving Elena meant condemning Angie, and there was no way he would take that risk. Elliot is 30. The sun was already high in the sky when they got to the overseas highway running from Miami to Key West. It felt like they'd reached the end of the earth. A string of islands stretched for 150 miles in a turquoise sea that looked like a Polynesian lagoon. Elliot and Elena were in heaven, astonished by the pelicans flying just over their heads and intoxicated by the impression that they were sailing over the ocean at the wheel of their car. The long, straight causeway ran over crystal-clear water, sweeping island to island via dozens of bridges built on stilts. They'd put the top down in the Thunderbird and had found a station playing classic rock. They drove fast, intoxicated by their speed and the magical landscape. They stopped on Key Largo at a fisherman's shack that they had turned into a restaurant. Surrounded by coral reefs, they feasted on crab cakes, conch, and shrimp. Just before they got back on the road, Elliot stopped at the post office. "I want to call Matt to remind him to feed my dog." "Okay, handsome. While you do that, I'll buy some sun lotion." Elliot went into the building, which was decorated with navigation charts, fishing nets, and models of boats. He'd mulled it over all morning and thought he'd come up with a new way of sending a message to the future. He went up to the window and said he wanted to send 2 telegrams to San Francisco. The first began, "Matt, thanks for everything, but I still need your help. Please don't try to understand what I'm going to ask you to do. One day I'll explain everything. In the meantime, trust me." San Francisco, 1976. Matt is 30. The golden light of the late afternoon filtered through the linen curtains. On his guitar, Matt was playing Tiffany a ballad he told her he'd written himself. He'd borrowed some chords from Elton John, along with the words, which he'd only changed in order to incorporate his current conquest's name and make the song his own, asked Tiffany, not taken in for a minute. Stretched out on the couch, she looked at him with eyebrows raised, sipping a drink. Matt put down his guitar and walked toward her, smiling. "Okay," I admitted. "I'm no James Taylor." She took another sip of her drink and smiled back at him. Even when he apologizes, this guy turns on the charm, she thought to herself as she sat up. And the worst thing is that it works. She had reached a point in her life when she no longer expected anything from men, though that still didn't stop her from falling in love with them. Matt sat down next to her, mesmerized by the perfection of her legs and her devastating cleavage. Not only is this girl a knockout, but she's smarter than she looks. There was something just a little bit frightening about that. Matt was always afraid that he wouldn't measure up in such matters. He hadn't gone to college, and he felt inferior because of his lack of education, even though he was too proud to admit it. He leaned toward Tiffany and kissed her on the lips. "Okay, Matt, don't get distracted. Just concentrate on one thing: sex." He'd gone to a lot of trouble to persuade Tiffany to give him another chance. It hadn't been easy, but he was about to reach his goal. Taking his time, he prolonged the delicious moment. He put his hand on her thigh and slid it slowly toward... "Anybody home?" Matt jumped to his feet. Unbelievable! "Western Union!" yelled a voice on the other side of the door. "I have 2 telegrams for Matt DeLuca." While Tiffany straightened her dress, Matt grumbled and opened the door, collected his messages, and gave the telegram man a tip. "They're numbered," he said. "You have to read them in order." Matt feverishly ripped open the first envelope. In his mind, telegrams were associated with bad news: death, illness, accident. He unfolded it and read the few lines typed on little strips of blue paper. It was a message from Elliot, fairly long and muddled, but 2 sentences caught his attention. "Trust me," and a little further on, "Go to my place as soon as possible." "I'm terribly sorry, but I have to leave," he told Tiffany. As though she'd been expecting as much, she got off the couch, picked up her shoes, and stood in front of him. "If you walk through that door, you know you'll never sleep with me." He looked at her intently. The last rays of sunlight made her dress transparent, showing off her mesmerizing curves. "It's an emergency," he explained. "What about me? I'm not an emergency?" She stared back at him, and sensed that beneath his playboy exterior there was more to him than there appeared on the surface. She would have liked to have held on to him, but there was no way she was going to let this go a second time. "You'll regret it as long as you live," she said, casually unfastening a button on her dress. "That I'm sure of," Matt agreed. "Well, too bad." She picked up her purse and left. "You poor sap," she said, and shut the door behind her. Florida, 1976. Elliot is 30. Elliot and Elena reached Key West just as the sun was setting the horizon ablaze. They had reached the end of their journey, the southernmost point in the United States, where America began and ended. With its narrow streets, tropical gardens, and colonial houses, the place seemed to be outside time. They parked the Thunderbird near the shore and walked a few steps along the beach, amidst the herons and pelicans. Then they went to a little cafe where the regulars liked to chew the fat and solve the problems of the world. They had arranged to meet Roberto Cruz, Elena's uncle, a long-time resident of the island who'd been Hemingway's factotum when the writer had lived on Key West in the 1930s. Since then, the town had bought the house and turned it into a museum, and Roberto worked there as the shirt and graying beard. He was cultivating a resemblance to the famous writer. He lived in a small building next to the museum, and he insisted that Elliot and Elena stay with him rather than in a hotel. They accepted and followed him home. "Welcome to Hemingway's house," he said, as he opened the iron gate to reveal a handsome Spanish colonial house. As he went into the garden, Elliot was wondering if Matt had gotten his telegrams. San Francisco, 1976. Matt is 30. "Hello, Tramp," said Matt as he opened the door to Elliot's house. The lab ran up barking, delighted to have the company. Matt scratched the dog's head and took him out to the garden after he'd filled his dish. Lost in thought, he stood for a few minutes leaning against a tree, reading and rereading the telegram from his friend. Matt was worried. For the last several days, Elliot's behavior and what he said had seemed completely illogical, and he reproached himself for not managing to dispel his friend's fantasies. He'd thought all he had to do to get Elliot's feet back on the ground was to get him on a plane to Elena, but it hadn't worked. From the very beginning, he'd thought this whole time-traveler business was trouble. As the days had gone by, he'd been plagued by the feeling that something serious was going to happen to his friend. Despite his skepticism, he carried out to the letter the instructions in the telegram. Elliot may have been losing his marbles, but Matt had decided to stay loyal to his friend, who was his only family, the one person who kept him steady. Matt was an orphan. He'd spent his childhood and adolescence in the Paris region, shunted from family to family. He'd left school at 15 without qualifications. After a series of dead-end jobs, he got involved in some shady deals. Several times he found himself mixed up in brawls that had turned nasty, and he'd spent a few nights in the police station. As he was beginning to be known to the police, he decided to leave France and take his chances in America. Since he had nothing to lose, he sold everything he owned and bought a one-way ticket to the New World. Many people in his situation would have given up long before, but he was resourceful and had a gift for friendship. First in New York and then in California, he'd immediately felt at home in this open society that attached little significance to diplomas or social origin. As the first telegram had promised, Matt found a large atlas in the library. It was old, but still magnificent, with its detailed plates protected by tissue paper. Without opening the second telegram, he slipped it between pages 66 and 67 and put the book back on the shelf. Then he went into the garage, rummaged in the toolbox, found an old soldering iron, and went back into the house with it. He plugged it in Elliot's office, let it heat up for a minute, cautiously picked it up, and applied the reddened tip to the heavy wooden work table. San Francisco, 2006. Elliot is 60. It had been dark for a long time when Elliot got back to the marina. He was coming from the airport where Angie had taken the last flight to New York. As he opened the door to the house, a feeling of intense dejection and solitude set in. Lost in thought, he moved toward the window in his office, looking at the lights of the port glowing in the darkness without really seeing them. The house was like him, sad and icy freezing and desolate. Trembling with cold, he rubbed his arms to warm them up. As he drew near the radiator, he came to a stop. On his office table was a clumsily written inscription made with a soldering iron. Large Atlas, page 66. He was flabbergasted and moved closer. This horrible graffiti hadn't been there that morning, yet it already seemed to have a patina of age. Who had decided to answer the question? After the tattoo, the jerk was now trying to send him another message. He just had to figure out what it meant. Large atlas. It took him a minute to figure out the reference. The only atlas he'd ever owned was a gift his mother had given him only a few days before her suicide. He'd faithfully kept the book in his library, but he'd never opened it. He went over to the shelves and climbed on a chair so he could reach it. Page 66. He hastily turned the pages. Could it be that after so long? A pale blue envelope fell onto the floor. A telegram? He hadn't seen one in years. He picked it up, and, not even examining it, frantically tore it open along the perforations. Inside were a few typed lines that had traveled through time and waited 30 years for someone to set eyes on them. Surprised? You think you're all-powerful, don't you? Because you found a way of making return trips into the past. You think you're entitled to drive other people mad with anxiety and leave with no questions asked. Well, it doesn't work like that. Because if you think about it, you may know my future, but I'm the one who controls your past. You can't do anything against me, but the consequences of my actions influence your life. Now I've turned the tables and I'm running the show. I want some explanations, and I want them now. I'll be waiting for you, tonight. Terrified by what he'd just read, Elliot set the telegram on the table. He'd opened Pandora's box, and his worst fears were coming true. He thought about the situation for a few seconds, and then, resigned, took hold of the bottle of pills that he always kept with him and forced himself to swallow one. There was a flash of lightning and a rumble of thunder outside. The living room window threw back at him the gaze of the man who was now his worst enemy, himself. Chapter 13. Fourth Encounter. We go through the present blindfolded. Only later, when the blindfold is removed and we examine the past, do we realize what we've been through and understand what it means. Milan Kundera. Key West, Florida, 2 a.m. Elliot is 30. The raging storm had knocked out all the power on Key West. Elliot was unable to sleep. Without waking Elena from her deep slumber, he lit the oil lamp and decided to explore Hemingway's house. Lit by lightning, the house seemed to be shaken by rain and wind like a ship in a storm at sea. As Elliot was mounting the central staircase, a powerful thunderclap made all the windows rattle. The young doctor shuddered and thought for an instant of going back, but he shrugged his shoulders and pressed on. Even so, he had had a fright. At the top of the stairs, he walked across the creaking floor to the study. He was carefully opening the door when something hissed and struck him in the face. A cat! He remembered having read that Hemingway adored cats and had owned 50 of them. He touched his face. The cat had given him a deep scratch on the cheek as it flew past. Really, me and animals. He took a few steps into the study, admiring the personal objects of the great writer. His old typewriter that had been with him in Spain during the Civil War, a ceramic given to him by Picasso, a collection of fountain pens, a threatening-looking African mask, dozens of press clippings and photographs. There was a magical atmosphere in the room. There was no denying that between fishing jaunts and drinking bouts, Papa Hemingway had taken the time to write some masterpieces in Key West, among them A Farewell to Arms and The Snows of Kilimanjaro. Not a bad track record, thought Elliot, as the lights finally came back on. He blew out the lamp and went over to an old record player. He carefully put the first record that came to hand on the turntable, and a few seconds later the sound of a violin and a guitar filled Stefan Grappelli, the best jazzman of the 30s. But the record suddenly stopped. The lights sputtered, and the room was plunged into darkness again. Just my luck, thought Elliot again. Why did I blow out that lamp? He wanted to light it again, but he'd left his lighter in the bedroom. It was hard to see anything in the study except for the streams of rain running down the windows. He remained motionless in the dark for a few minutes, hoping that the lights would come back on at any moment. He suddenly felt a presence, heard breathing, then a metallic sound. "Who's there?" he asked in an anxious voice. The only answer was the flame of a lighter that sprang up a few yards in front of him. He recognized the glowing eyes of his double, staring back at him in the darkness. "You want some explanations? All right, I'll give them to you." The old doctor lit the wick on the oil lamp, settled into a brown leather armchair, and turned to Elliot. "Tell me what's going to happen to Elena," Elliot shouted with youthful impatience. "Sit down and stop yelling." Fidgeting impatiently, Elliot grudgingly agreed to take a seat on the other side of the desk. The old doctor reached into an inside jacket pocket and took out a photograph. "Her name is Angie," he explained, handing over the picture. "She's 20, and she's the most important person in the world to me." Elliot studied the photograph attentively. "Is her mother?" "No, her mother is not Elena." The old man cut him off, anticipating the question. "Why?" "Because when my daughter was born, Elena had been dead for 10 years. Elliot took in the information without blinking. "Why should I believe you?" "Because I have no reason to lie to you." The young doctor then asked the question that had been tormenting him since the night before. "Suppose that's true. Why do you say I'm the one who killed her?" The man facing him paused, as though he were weighing each word before stating, "You killed her because you love her badly." "I've heard enough crap from you." Furious now, Elliot got to his feet. "You love her as though you have your whole life before you. That's not the way to love." Elliot considered this argument briefly and rejected it. This wasn't the real problem. Right now he had to get as much information as possible, not philosophize about love. He turned the conversation back to the only thing that really interested him. "How is Elena supposed to die?" "She's going to have an accident." "An accident? What kind of accident? And when?" "Again you ask. You can't expect me to tell you. Why? Because I don't want you to save her." For a few seconds, Elliot remained silent and motionless, staring at the curtain of rain covering the window. He felt this conversation was getting away from him, and he no longer had a grasp on what it meant. "But it's now or never. You found a way to go back in time, and you intend to let the woman you love die? Don't think for 1 minute that I'm doing this willingly." The old man sounded exasperated. He pounded his fist on the desk. "I've been thinking of nothing else for 30 years. If only I could save her. If only. So stop thinking about it. Do it." "No." "Why not?" "Because if we save Elena, you'll live your life with her." "So? So then you'll never have Angie." Elliot wasn't sure he understood. "Where's the problem?" he asked, shrugging his shoulders. "I'll have other children." "Other children? But I don't give a damn about your other children. I don't want to lose my daughter. I don't want a world where Angie doesn't exist. And I won't let Elena die," Elliot answered with determination. Impelled by their anger, the two men had stood up. They were now only a few inches apart, facing each other, ready to try one last bluff. "Maybe you think you have the upper hand because you're younger. But without me, you'll never know how Elena died, and you won't be able to do anything to save her." "Yeah, well, if Elena dies, don't count on me to be the father of your Angie." "When you're a father, you'll understand me, Elliot. You don't abandon your child, even to save the woman you love." They stood like that for a long time, staring at each other, neither one budging. The complicity that had brought them together at their last meeting had been replaced by antagonism. This was the struggle of a man against himself at 2 different ages. They were each ready to fight to the end, one to save his woman, the other not to lose his daughter. The conversation was at an impasse when the older man glimpsed a way out. "How far are you prepared to go to save Elena?" "As far as necessary," Elliot answered, not batting an eyelash. "What are you prepared to give up?" "Everything." "Then maybe I have an idea." The rain was still coming down in torrents. The two men had ended up sitting next to each other on the walnut bench next to the desk. Through the window behind them, the beacon from the Key West lighthouse shone at regular intervals, casting their shadows on the wall and the floor. "You want to save Elena, and that's understandable. But you can only do it if you promise to respect 3 conditions. 3 conditions? The first is that you speak to no one about what's happening to us. Not to Elena, of course. But not even to Matt." "I trust Matt," Elliot protested. "It's not a question of trust. It's a question of danger. Listen, I'm convinced we're making a mistake, a terrible mistake, by trying to go against fate, and we'll pay dearly for it sooner or later. I'm ready to take the risk with you, on condition you do not involve anyone else." "What's the second condition?" "If we manage to save Elena, you'll have to leave her." "Leave her?" Elliot asked, completely incredulous. "Leave her and never see her again. She stays alive, but you'll have to live your life as if she were dead." Elliot took a while to grasp the enormity of this. He opened his mouth, but was unable to speak. "I know very well that I'm asking you something terrible," the old doctor acknowledged. "And what's the third condition?" he finally managed to croak. "In 9 years, on April 6, 1985, at a surgical conference in Verona, you'll meet a woman who will show interest in you. You'll respond to her advances and spend a weekend with her, during which our daughter will be conceived. This is how you'll have to act because it's the only way to save both Elena and Angie." More ominous growls of thunder rumbled through the sky. When Elliot still didn't answer, his double explained, "This is the price you pay for changing destiny. But you're free to refuse." The old man stood up and buttoned his coat as though he were about to go out in the rain. Elliot understood then that he had no choice but to accept the pact. In a fraction of a second, the happy years he had lived with Elena flashed before his eyes. At the same time, he understood that this happiness would soon be at an end. To save her, he had to be ready for the misery of losing her. As his double was about to leave the room, Elliot put out his hand to detain him. "I accept," he said emphatically. His double did not turn around. He merely answered, "I'll be back soon," and closed the door behind him. Chapter 14. Fifth Encounter. Everything that must happen will happen, whatever your efforts to avoid it. Everything that must not happen will not happen, whatever your efforts to bring it about. Ramana Maharshi. I have noticed that even people who assert that everything is predestined and that we can change nothing about it look both ways before they cross the street. Stephen Hawking. San Francisco, 1976. Elliot is 30. October, November, December. 3 months with no news from the future. On the surface, life had returned to normal. Elliot treated his patients at the hospital. Elena worried about her whales. Matt had not seen Tiffany again, but he was working hard to make a go of the vineyard he'd bought with Elliot. Although he tried to distract himself, the young doctor was in a constant state of anxiety, worrying about the slightest detail to do with Elena, and constantly expecting his double to reappear. His face again. On some days, Elliot started to hope that he'd dreamed the whole business. Suppose the encounters had happened purely in his head. After all, that wasn't impossible. More and more people were suffering from burnout caused by stress and overwork that could lead to depression and delusions. Maybe he'd been a victim of that syndrome. Maybe now, things were back to normal, and the episode would turn out to be nothing but a bad memory. He would dearly have loved to believe it. Winter had settled on San Francisco, blanketing the city in a cold gray mantle, with only the Christmas lights cheering things up. Elliot was in a good mood when he got to the hospital on the morning of December 24th. It was his last day on call before vacation. Elena was supposed to meet him that night, and the next day they would leave together for Honolulu for a week of lounging under the palm trees. The sun had not yet risen when an ambulance came roaring into the hospital parking lot. In it was a stretcher bearing a woman with severe burns. It had all begun a half-hour earlier, when firefighters had gone to put out a blaze that had just started in a building in Haight-Ashbury. It was an old, decrepit place that junkies sometimes used to crash in. At 5 o'clock, a young woman in the middle of a bad heroin trip had poured gasoline on her body and struck a match. Her name was Emily Duncan. She was 20 years old and had only a few hours left to live. With the emergency services requiring a surgeon, Elliot was called to help immediately. When he examined the patient, he was shocked by the severity of the burns. Her entire body was covered with lesions, third-degree burns that had disfigured her legs, her back, her chest. Almost all her hair had burned off, and her face could barely be identified through the wounds. A wide burn seemed to be compressing her chest to the point of strangulation. To make it easier for her to breathe, Elliot decided to make 2 lateral incisions. But as he held the scalpel over her body, he felt his hand draw back. He closed his eyes for an instant, trying to clear his mind and regain concentration. His professionalism finally overcame his emotions, and he could begin operating without shaking. For a good part of the morning, the medical team struggled over Emily, doing everything possible to give her the best care and to soothe the intense pain she was suffering. It soon became obvious, however, that the young woman could not be saved. Her burns were too extensive, her lung capacity too weak, and her kidneys no longer functioning. They decided just to stabilize her and wait. When Elliot came into Emily's room in the early afternoon, he found her covered with bandages and surrounded by drips. He was surprised by the strange calm pervading the room, the prologue to a wake disturbed only by the beeping of the heart monitor. Elliot approached the bed and looked at the young woman. Her blood pressure was still worrying, although the effects of the heroin had worn off and she seemed to have recovered consciousness. Enough perhaps to understand that she was doomed. He sat down silently on a stool near this woman whom he did not know, and for whom he could no longer do anything. No family had been found, and no one was there to be with her for her last battle. Elliot would have preferred to be somewhere else, but he did not avoid the desperate gaze that she fixed on him. He saw in it terror, but also questions to which he had no answer. At one point, she tried to whisper something to him. He leaned over, lifted up the oxygen mask, and thought he heard, "It hurts." To ease the pain, he decided to increase the dose of morphine. He was going to write the order when he suddenly understood that Emily had not said, "It hurts," but, "I'm afraid." What could he say to that? That he too was afraid? That he was sorry he wasn't able to save her? That on a day like today, life didn't seem to have any meaning? He would have liked both to take her in his arms and to shout out his indignation. Why had she done such circumstances lead you to a dilapidated crash pad drugged to the eyeballs? What inner pain could justify sprinkling yourself with gasoline and setting yourself on fire when you're barely 20? He would have liked to shout all that to her. But that's not what doctors are supposed to do in hospitals. So he just stayed with her, giving her all the compassion he could, because there was no one else to do it. It was Christmas Eve. The hospital was short-staffed, and above all, the system wasn't prepared for this. The system was set up for treatment, not to provide support. Emily was having more and more trouble breathing and couldn't stop shivering. Elliot knew she was suffering horribly in spite of the morphine. He also knew that he would never forget her eyes desperately staring into his. You always think you've seen everything in this job, but it's not true. You think you know the worst, but the worst is always yet to come. And something still worse is just around the corner. 1 hour, then another went by. At 3, when Elliot's shift was officially over, he got up quietly. "I'll be back," he promised Emily. He went out into the corridor and pressed the button for the elevator. He had to tell Elena, explain that he couldn't pick her up at the airport, and that he would probably get home in the middle of the night. He went to the phone booth in the lobby and dialed the number for Ocean World, hoping that she hadn't already left. The receptionist answered, and he asked to be connected with the veterinarian's office. He heard Elena's voice say, "Hello?" "Hi," he started, before realizing he was talking to no one. He turned his head. Someone had put their hand on the hook and cut off the conversation. His double. "It's today," the old man informed him. "Today? Elena is to die today." Together, the two doctors went up to the roof of the hospital. At different ages, they'd come here to smoke without having to endure the critical looks of their colleagues. Here, at least, they knew they would be left in relative peace. As Elliot was pacing restlessly, eager to know more, his double grasped him firmly by the shoulder. "You must not make that call." "Why?" "Because Elena will not understand." "What?" "That you're neglecting her to stay with the patient after your shift is over. You haven't seen her for 3 weeks. She's expecting you to pick her up at the airport and that you'll spend the evening together." Elliot tried to justify himself. "That young woman... What's happened to her is terrible. She has no one and I know." The old man sympathized. 30 years ago, I stayed up with her all night, and I've never forgotten her." His voice full of emotion, he went on. "But in the early morning, when I left the hospital, some terrible news was waiting for me. The woman I loved was dead." Elliot didn't understand. What's the connection between this patient and Elena's death? "I'll tell you everything," the old man promised. "I just want to be sure our agreement still holds." "It does," Elliot assured him. "Then this is what will happen if you make that phone call." The old doctor began his story. He talked for a long time in an agitated voice tinged by regret. Elliot had closed his eyes to concentrate on listening. Pictures ran through his mind like a movie. "Hello? Hi, it's me. It won't do you any good. You won't find out what your present is until tonight. Listen, darling, I have a problem." "What's the matter?" "I can't come and get you at the airport." "I thought you finished at 3 o'clock. "That's true, my shift is over, but I have to stay with a patient. A young woman who tried to commit suicide this morning in a crash pad." "An addict?" "What difference does it make?" "If I understand correctly, you're telling me that you're spending Christmas Eve in the hospital with the junkie you've known for only a few hours?" "I'm only doing my job." "Your job?" "Listen, you think you're the only one who has a job?" "I'm tired of waiting for you, Elliot." "Why are you reacting like this?" "Because I've been waiting for you for 10 years, and you don't even see it." "We'll talk about all this tomorrow morning." "No, Elliot. I'm not coming to San Francisco. Call me back when you're sure you want to spend your life with me." Elliot stood in the phone booth for several minutes. 3 times he picked up the receiver, ready to call Elena back, apologize, and try to patch things up. But he didn't do it, because he could not abandon the young woman dying 2 floors above him. Elena waited in front of the telephone for half an hour. Then, when she understood that Elliot would not call back, she furiously ripped up her airplane ticket and threw it in the wastebasket. She also threw away the gift she'd bought, and that he'd never see, a watch engraved with his initials. She left the office completely demoralized and took refuge in the park's private gardens, where she cried her eyes out in front of the indifferent gaze of the flamingos and the alligators. Then she decided to cancel her vacation and go back to work. She spent the end of the afternoon following her usual routine, as though nothing had happened. It had been dark for some time when she ended her inspection with a visit to her favorite whale. "Hello, Anushka. You're not doing so well either, are you?" For the last few days, the matriarch of the Ocean World whales had been depressed, refusing to eat or to participate in the shows. Her fin was flaccid, and her gentleness had given way to aggression toward her trainers and the other whales in the tank. The cause of her behavior was not hard to guess. Her 8-year-old daughter, Erica, had been taken away from her to participate in a whale breeding program in Europe. A 20-hour plane trip in an iron box without even a trainer to comfort her. What had they been thinking of? Elena had done everything she could to oppose the transfer, emphasizing the traumatic consequences of the separation, explaining that the members of a pod never parted in the wild. But for financial reasons, management hadn't followed her recommendations. The truth was, aquatic parks were expecting that capturing whales would soon be prohibited, and were trying to increase births in captivity. "Come on, baby." Elena had leaned over the water to encourage the whale to approach the edge. But Anushka did not respond to her calls. The whale was swimming in circles, distraught, emitting plaintive whistles. Elena was afraid that her immune system had been weakened. Despite appearances, these giants were fragile, at the mercy of any passing microbe. Kidney and lung infections were common. Joachim, the dominant male in the tank, had had that bitter experience 6 months earlier when he was struck down by septicemia. This was what sometimes happened to these giants. They were conquered by something minuscule. Elena was beginning to feel increasingly uncomfortable about keeping whales in captivity. Imprisoned within 4 walls, splashing around in chemically treated water, fed with vitamins and antibiotics, dolphins and whales in aquatic parks did not have the ideal life that was presented to visitors. As for the shows, they were certainly impressive, but weren't they a kind of insult to the species, whose cognitive capacities were not very different from those of humans? Suddenly, for no apparent reason, Anushka started to charge, violently striking her head against the metal rail around the tank. "Stop that!" Elena ordered, and quickly plunged a pole in the water to drive the animal off. She'd seen whales with suicidal tendencies before, and it was clear that Anushka was trying to injure herself on purpose. Elena was worried, and threw her a few fish to distract her. "Calm down! Calm down, lovely!" Gradually, the animal's assaults grew less powerful, and Anushka seemed to recover her calm. "That's good, Anushka," said Elena, a little reassured, until she saw a long trail of blood staining the surface of the water. "Oh, no!" From banging into the rail so many times, the whale had wounded herself. The young veterinarian leaned over the water. At first glance, the wound seemed to be on the animal's jaw. Elena should have followed the trainer's golden rule. Never approach a whale when it's aggressive, and never get into the water with one if you're not certain of its cooperation. She should have set off the alarm. She should have alerted her colleagues. She should have. But still feeling the effects of her quarrel with Elliot, Elena had let her guard down. She dove into the tank where Anushka had resumed her frenetic circling. When she sensed that Elena was coming toward her, the whale leaped on her at once, opening her mouth as though to bite, and dragged her toward the bottom. Elena fought back, but the whale was much stronger. Every time Elena came back to the surface, the animal forced her underwater, giving her no rest. Elena was a skilled swimmer who was able to hold her breath for several minutes, but you can't struggle for long against an animal that weighs 4 tons and measures 18 feet. At one point, when she had given up hope, she managed to reach the surface and take a breath. She made a desperate attempt to swim to the edge of the tank, and she was almost there when she turned around. In an instant of horror, she had time to see the enormous tail fin coming down on her with phenomenal speed. The shock was terrible, and the ensuing pain so intense that she almost lost consciousness. She sank without a struggle, allowing herself to be drawn to the bottom. In a final moment of lucidity, as her lungs were filling with salt water, the young woman wondered why Anushka, whom she had been training for years, had reacted so violently. There was probably no answer to that question. Maybe in the long run, life in a tank makes you crazy. Her last thought was for the man she loved. She'd always been convinced that they would grow old together. And here she was going first, not even 30 years old. But you don't choose your fate. Life had decided for them like it always does. Gripped by panic and terror, plunged into darkness, Elena was seized by a deadly current. As she was finally floating over to the other side, she regretted only that they'd left each other in the middle of a quarrel, and that the last image Elliot would have of her would be tainted with bitterness and resentment. The wind blowing on the hospital roof felt like icy breath. As though waking from a nightmare, Elliot opened his eyes as his double was coming to the end of his terrible story. The two men stood in silence, one terrified by what he had just heard, the other still dazed by the story he had told. Elliot shook himself, opened his mouth to speak, and then hesitated. Anticipating his doubts, the old doctor took a yellowed clipping out of his pocket. "If you don't believe me," he began. Elliot practically tore the paper out of his hands. It was an old article from the Miami Herald. Despite its yellowed appearance, the clipping was dated the next day, December 25th, 1976. His hands shaking, Elliot read through the article, which was accompanied by a large photograph of Elena. Young veterinarian killed by whale. In a terrible accident last night at Ocean World in Orlando, a killer whale attacked its trainer for unknown reasons. It took only a few minutes for the whale to overpower and drown the woman who was trying to help it, Elena Cruz, the park veterinarian. While the precise circumstances of the accident remain unclear, it seems that the veterinarian did not follow all the safety procedures. Pending further investigation, the park's management has declined to comment. When Elliot looked up from the article, he saw the old doctor walking off into the fog. "Now it's up to you," he said, opening the metal door and disappearing. Feeling abandoned, Elliot stayed on the roof for a little while longer, disturbed and chilled by the cold, disbelief, and indecision. Then he stopped asking himself questions. The time had come to take action. He didn't care about the price he'd have to pay. He was going to save the woman he loved, and nothing else mattered. He stormed into the lobby like a guided missile and pushed his way past several colleagues in his rush toward the phone. He dialed Elena's number. A couple of rings. The seconds seemed like minutes. Then finally he heard a voice. "Hello? Hi, it's me. It won't do you any good. You won't find out what your present is until tonight. Listen, darling. What's the matter? Nothing. I'll come and get you at the airport later as we planned. I can't wait to see you. Me neither. Your voice sounds funny. Are you sure you're all right? Now I'm fine. After he hung up, Elliot couldn't bear to go back to the room and face Emily's gaze as she died her slow death. He asked one of the nurses on duty to check on her regularly, then put on his coat and went out into the parking lot. Did what he'd just done make any sense at all? Had he really changed his and Elena's future? Is one sentence instead of another all it takes sometimes to change your whole life? All these questions were jumbled together in his head as he walked toward his car. Automatically, he lit a cigarette and put his hands in his pockets to warm up. He felt the newspaper clipping in one of them, and suddenly had a flash of inspiration. If he had changed the future, Elena had not had her accident, and a reporter had not written the article, so that article didn't exist. Intrigued, he took the yellowed paper out of his pocket, unfolded it, and turned it in every direction. Unbelievably, the content was not the same. As though by magic, Elena's photo was gone, and, instead of the article relating the death of the young veterinarian, there was another front-page story. Ocean World. Death of a whale. Anushka, the matriarch of the killer whales in Orlando's Ocean World, died last night from a jaw wound caused by a collision with the metal shell of the tank. The wound seems to have been self-inflicted. Park management acknowledged that depression may have accounted for the whale's actions. The park had just transferred her daughter to another zoo. Ocean World will open as normal today. No member of staff was hurt. Chapter 15. Sixth Encounter. He was my north, my south, my east and west. W. H. Auden. San Francisco, 1976. Elliot is 30. It's Christmas Day. On this December morning, California's mild weather has been replaced by gray skies and cold. San Francisco looks a little like New York, and it almost seems as though it's about to snow. The house is silent, bathed in the pale light of dawn. Snuggled against Elliot's shoulder, Elena is sleeping peacefully. But the young doctor has the deathly look of someone who hasn't slept all night. Elliot turns toward Elena, kisses her tenderly, careful not to wake her, and looks at her for several minutes, aware that these are their last moments together. One last time he breathes in the aroma of her hair, moves his lips over her velvety skin, and listens to the rhythm of her heartbeat. Then he notices his silent tears falling on the sheet. He puts on a sweater and a pair of jeans and leaves the room without making a sound. He cannot bring himself to believe that he's going to leave her. He knows he made an agreement with his double, but now that Elena is saved, what could stop him from staying with her? How could that bastard retaliate to force him to honor his part of the contract? Crushed by despair, he drags himself from room to room, hoping, without really believing it, that he'll come across his other self so he can let fly all his anger and indignation. But his double doesn't show his face. The 60-year-old Elliot has fulfilled his side of the bargain, and now it's up to his younger self to keep his promise. Goes into the kitchen and collapses on a chair. Near the door stand their bags ready for a trip to Hawaii that neither he nor Elena will ever take, because he knows that he has no choice but to leave her. He feels a force inside him, a voice impelling him to follow that course. He is nothing but a puppet whose strings are being pulled by an unknown power off stage. The glass table reflects his face back to him, emaciated and disheveled. He feels empty, defeated, as though he has lost all self-confidence and any sense of how the world works. From the very first day he met his double, he has had the impression he's living in a universe that follows no known laws. Gripped by fear of the unknown, he can no longer sleep, he doesn't eat, and he's tormented by all kinds of impossible questions. Why is this happening to him? Is this encounter a blessing or a curse? Is he still completely sane? Having no one to talk to about his problem is killing him. Suddenly, he hears a sound. The floor creaks, and Elena comes into the room wearing nothing but panties and a shirt tied at the waist. She gives him a mischievous smile and hums an ABBA tune. He knows it's the last time he'll see her happy. She is beautiful beyond belief, and they have never been more in love. And yet, in a few seconds, everything is going to come apart.
End of CD 5.